Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy EV series. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is my co-host, Neil Rydell. Neil, what are we talking about this week?
So we're going to do a classic electric cars episode with someone who knows this topic incredibly well. So I'm delighted that we got Jill Knoll with us. Now, Jill's moved into a new role recently with A3, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about why we're transitioning to electric cars and some of her experience and background in this area. So welcome, Jill.
Thanks so much, Neil. Thanks so much, Chris. Great to be here.
So let's start with the very beginning of this journey, Jill. Why are we transitioning to electric cars?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two really simple answers. One, they're just a fantastic way to get from A to B if you need to use a car at all. They're just a brilliant drive experience. But I think really fundamentally more important than that is that we all deserve to breathe clean air. Globally, air pollution from fossil fuels kills about 5 million people every year. Of more than, I think it's 8 million deaths across the world from outdoor air pollution, over 60% are linked to fossil fuels. And that was reported quite recently in the British medical journey. If we look at the UK, where I am based, poor air quality is linked to about 40,000 early deaths in the UK each year. And that's at a cost of about £20 billion to our economy. The UK government is moving to decarbonise as much as we can, but we need to do this just to give ourselves a chance of a cleaner, healthier future. And electric cars are a really, really important tool that will help us meet our climate change goals and indeed, what we call net zero. One thing that always strikes me is that the Committee on Climate Change has said that, again, for the UK, we need about 16 million all-electric cars on our roads by 2030 in order to meet our climate change goals. And current projections sit at between 8 to 10 million. So, although we're doing quite well, we've got a long, long way to go. And at the start, I said that actually one of the reasons is that they're also just a really, really great form of transport. They're really, really good to drive, 100% torque, so you just put your foot down and you're off. But they also can cost buttons to run, so really, really cheap to run, especially if you can charge at home. I'm lucky enough, I have an electric car, not surprisingly, probably. I do most of my charging at home overnight. I'm lucky because I do have a driveway. So it costs me less than £5, and I think that's just over $6, something like that, to fully charge my car. And that gives me about 280 miles worth of real world driving range. Because, again, I'm fortunate I'm on an off-peak energy tariff. And the other great thing is that I can then shift lots of my other big energy use into those off-peak hours. My dishwasher, washing machine, things like that. So there are kind of added benefits as well to being able to charge at home if you have an electric car.
That's pretty interesting. It's interesting when you're converting, a full charge to about $6 US. I guess, is there still the premium on an EV vehicle? So are the economics going to work out? I mean, because a tank of gas may be considerably more, especially in the UK where your per liter cost might be higher. But it averages still if you have to pay a premium for the EV. So where are we out of that? So is it really cheaper?
Yeah. No, that's a really, really good point, Chris. So if we look at the total cost of ownership, so that's throwing everything into the equation. So if you compare an electric car with its petrol or diesel equivalent, if you take into account how much it costs to charge that car or fuel that car, if you take into account, the maintenance costs, the insurance costs, either the upfront purchase or the cost of a lease over a period of years, then possibly surprisingly, in general, electric cars come out as good value or even better value than their petrol and diesel equivalents. I think probably at the moment, the clincher is if you can do most of your charging at home. But I think anyway, actually, on balance, even if you do have to use public chargers, as long as you're not using the most expensive ones, and again, the price is has crept up a little bit again in the UK, then I think on balance, you're probably better off with an electric car. And I've been involved in quite a number of surveys on this, and it can be quite surprising actually. Some of the responses that I get back, people say yes, of course it is about cost, and certainly in terms of barriers to making the switch, that upfront cost is a big barrier. However, prices are coming down, and quite often people do say, but it's more than just about cost. It is the drive experience, it is the fact that there's zero tailpipe emission, and people more and more are coming to understand that we need to do something about that and clean up our local air quality. What has surprised me again a little bit recently is that I heard somebody saying the other day, actually somebody from Auto Trader in the UK, say that if we're thinking about the used car market, the used market for electric vehicles, then actually not only are they selling faster than petrol and diesel cars these days, but many of those have reached price parity with their petrol and diesel counterparts. And I don't know what it's like so much elsewhere, but certainly in the UK, it's something like 6 million people buy used cars every year, and about 1.5 million buy new. So that second-hand market for EV is really, really, really important, and the prices have really, really come down. So for a lot more people, it's making a lot more sense to go electric.
So, what does all of this mean for businesses? I heard you talk about total cost of ownership, and total cost of ownership sounds like a complex equation where you put everything together and you're going, okay, right, so I've got the cost of the upfront capital, the cost of the electricity, cost of chargers, insurance probably comes in there. There's probably a lot that drops into that bucket. What does this mean for a business?
Yeah, so there's a really big carrot to encourage businesses and indeed fleets to transition to electric in the UK. So we have very low tax rates in the form of benefit in kind. That means actually for business leasing, and also EV salary sacrifice schemes. So that's where employees can save up to about 40% on a sort of traditional electric car lease, if you like. It can really make it's good economic sense to go electric, and for any business that is looking to decarbonise their fleet or indeed help their staff to make the switch to electric. It can also really help boost a company's sustainability credentials. And I have read reports that suggest that certainly for salary sacrifice schemes for electric cars, then it's a really good way to both attract and help retain staff. But I would say as well that of course businesses vary wildly in size and in terms of the operations that they undertake. So certainly it's not a case of one size fits all. I think there is still quite a big challenge, again, certainly in the UK with electric vans. There are certainly some on the market, and choice and range is starting to increase. And I get very excited where I live because I see a lot of electric delivery vans around here, and I have a chat with the driver whenever I can. But I think there's still a long way to go, and the electric van market feels to certainly be a few years behind the domestic passenger car market. And indeed, I heard the Society for Motor Manufacturers and Traders recently say that actually certainly if we're looking at heavy goods vehicles, then that market is about 14 years behind cars. So again, there's still quite a long way to go.
Yeah, interesting. We'll probably talk about electric trucks at some point. So these all sound like quite good news stories. But we've talked a lot this year about FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. What is that, and why are we seeing so much of it at the moment?
Well, FUD is everywhere, let's face it. And so the practice of spreading that fear, uncertainty, and doubt is indeed widespread. It's in mainstream and social media. It's I see it on my sort of my social media networks on a daily basis, and it's really intended to undermine consumer confidence in switching to EV. Um, if we look at some of the classic cases of FUD, if you like, so one of those is cost. People are put off by the higher upfront cost, and even though, as we've discussed already, we are reaching price parity in terms of the second-hand market for electric vehicles, we still need to reach that price parity with new. I would suggest, even when we try and encourage people to look at the total cost of ownership. It's so often so difficult to get over that kind of higher upfront cost. Um, so I think cost is one of them. And we need to do whatever we can to encourage people to kind of look a little bit more deeply into it. I think another area is on range. For years now, we hear about range anxiety. And this is where people are worried that essentially an electric car isn't going to have enough range to get them from A to B. But I think we can really unpack that quite quickly. A third of all electric cars, at least on the market today, have a range of over about 250 miles, and I think it's sort of over a half have a range of over 200 miles. But if we go even deeper than that, certainly in the UK, the average daily journey is under 30 miles, and 99% of all journeys are under 100 miles. So, really, if you think about how far you drive on a daily basis, most of the time, an electric car will quite happily, get you to where you need to go. And indeed, I frequently am disappointed because I do not need to stop and charge en route. Possibly quite perversely, I really enjoy the whole charging in public experience, but more often than not, when I do go on that longer journey, I tend to charge when I arrive at my destination. Whether that's overnight or I don't know at the zoo or something like that. And I think again, there's a lot of messaging that we need to get out there to help people understand that actually electric cars really do go the distance these days, and it's only relatively infrequently, or for those relatively few regular long distance drivers, that charging is going to be an issue very often, which then probably brings us on to charging infrastructure. There's a lot of I think for me misinformation out there about sort of the perceived lack of charging infrastructure. We've got, I think it's over 53,000 public chargers in the UK at the moment, but we also have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of home and workplace chargers. And at the moment, certainly, most EV drivers do most of their charging at home. And then there's all sorts of really neat solutions emerging for on-street charging when people can't charge at home. But as much as we like to talk about the numbers of chargers, and the UK government has set a target for at least 300 public chargers by 2030. And I hear myself saying this so often, it is more than just a numbers game. We need to make sure that in terms of public charging, they're the right speed of chargers in the right locations, in the right numbers, that they are easy to use, they're easy to pay for, they are accessible and safe to use for all drivers. And I think the really good news on charging infrastructure is that charging companies, so the charge point operators in the UK, have committed £60 billion worth of investment in charging infrastructure to take us up to 2030. Which is really, really encouraging.
As you're talking about the charging infrastructure, and you seem to highlight the change in behavior. So I think one of the things that I wonder the economics as this trickles down. If I no longer go to my local service station, longer term, as more and more population charges at home, the business model of those service stations may change or diminish. And so, will there still be the public charging infrastructure once I no longer need to stop? Because right now, there's still plenty of gas cars going, and maybe I add an electric charging station or have a charging station at Walmart or at the store. Um, but are we looking at a paradigm shift to getting our energy for our vehicle?
Yeah, I think to a degree, quite possibly, Chris. I mean, there will, I think, always be a role for charging hubs. So not everybody is going to be able to charge at home. Again, taking the UK as an example, about 60% of households don't have access to off-street parking, and that's not to say that all those households have a car. However, a percentage of those will do, and I don't know, Neil, if you know what that number is. Um, but there's certainly going to be a significant number of people who will need to use public chargers, and that's only going to sort of increase. So I really like, if I can mention sort of names, I like the grid serve model, the electric forecourt. So that's kind of reimagining the whole petrol forecourt, and switching it entirely on its head to electric. However, it has a shop, it has a cafe, it even has meeting rooms. It's a really, really lovely environment, and I get far too excited. I've only visited once, but I really want to visit another one very soon. And so I think although probably business models will change to a degree, there's still going to be a role for those sort of charging hubs, those electric forecourts, and so on. And ultimately, I think of it as a little bit like the energy mix. So it's going to be a mix of charging solutions, that will work for different people, for different drivers at different times.
And this charging question comes up again and again, but I'm seeing increasingly that FUD is pointed in different directions. One of the ones which seems to repeatedly come up is fires. There's obviously questions around sourcing of minerals for batteries. How long the batteries last is another cracker. So there's some great stuff emerging. What's driving it all? What do we say to these people?
Oh, I know, Neil. It is everywhere, isn't it? So if we can touch on the battery point, then, understandably there are still concerns about their environmental impact. Um, but I think there's plenty of research now that shows that on a whole life cycle analysis, EVs produce about one third less carbon emissions, or is that fewer carbon emissions than petrol and diesel cars. And there's naturally quite a big focus on battery production and disposal, and associated ethical and environmental issues around lithium and cobalt mining. But if we take cobalt as an example, because I think this is one that does emerge a lot in terms of EV, then the cobalt content of batteries has been slashed by about 90%, I believe, in recent years. And there are now EVs driving around on our roads today that are entirely cobalt free. But if we look at cobalt used globally, then my understanding is that actually most is used in electronics, then in petrochemical refinement, and then the last figure I saw was about 10% is used in electric cars. So actually, I think it really helps to look at the bigger picture. And there's all sorts of uh, work going on as well in terms of cobalt with the Fair Cobalt Foundation, I think it is, that's really, really working hard to make sure that the supply chain is ethical. Um, and at the end of the day, as well, batteries just aren't going to end up in landfill because they are too valuable. I hear that a lot. Although we're just going to see landfill full of electric car batteries. They can be used in a range of storage applications, and also, of course, there's very strict regulations that govern what happens to them at the end of their life. Also, recycling technology is improving all the time, and up to, I don't know, something like 95% or even more of the materials can be recycled. And then there's, in terms of how long they last, because as you quite rightly say, that often comes up. That's one of those classic FUD pieces as well. I think quite recent real world data from Tesla has shown that even at 200,000 miles, then electric car batteries have only lost about 13% in terms of their capacity, which is, which is very little, relatively speaking. So it's not an issue. And if we're thinking about more people entering the EV market through the used market, then we need to make sure that we're sort of imbuing those customers with confidence that actually, their electric car battery, secondhand or not, is going to be absolutely fine. My first electric car was a secondhand Nissan Leaf, and I can, hand on heart say that it was not. It didn't even occur to me that there was going to be a problem with the battery. And on the fire front, I think you mentioned that as well, Neil. I think it was there was a study that was done relatively recently in Sweden, that showed that electric vehicles are 20 times less likely to catch fire than their petrol and diesel equivalents. And I think the issue though with EV fires is that whilst they are far less common than internal combustion engine vehicles catching fire, there's the issue of thermal runaway. And my understanding of thermal runaway is that where the battery's temperature skyrockets, then there's all sorts of chemical reactions that take place that spiral out of control. The battery generates really, really intense heat, which can then ignite anything that's flammable in or around the battery. So there's possibly, certainly, more work may well need to be done to understand the challenge that thermal runaway presents, with a view to really enhancing, safety features. But the key message there is that electric cars are far less likely to catch fire than petrol and diesel cars.
I believe there's even some tech coming to market whereby the battery won't catch fire at all, which is always a fascinating concept.
Wow.
So clearly, these electric cars are zooming around us all the time. And prior to your current role, you had some experience in the world of insurance. Do we see changes happening with the way that people drive, their driving behavior? Are people going faster? Are they having more accidents? Is there a change in driver behavior as a consequence of driving all these rather nice fancy cars around?
Yeah, I think the risk is when somebody first gets to drive an electric car, perhaps somebody who hasn't driven an electric car before. So it's in those first few, days, weeks, months, even up to a year, when somebody's really settling into the fact that actually I put my foot down and it just goes. The performance is absolutely phenomenal, and that's whether it's a 2015 Nissan Leaf or a 2023 Genesis GV60. So I think that's the challenge there. And funnily enough, a little while ago, I had a test drive in a Ford Mustang Mach-E. And I sat in the car, and the guy next to me said, "Okay, let's go." So I drove off, and he said, "Oh, you've driven electric cars before, haven't you?" And I said, "Yes, I have, quite a few." And he said, "I can really tell, because most people would nearly have gone into that wall, because it's just, and maybe, that the Mach-E as well, I found to be particularly responsive, shall we say. So, yeah. So, but then this is anecdotal. I do hear, I've spoken to so many people, and I've read about so many people on social media say that actually they are more aware of their driving, and actually electric cars make them into a calmer, better driver. Because perhaps you are a little bit more aware of your speed, and because you do want to just see how much range you can get and so on. So yeah, I think behavior change, yes, but I would like to think that.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask this question a bit of a weird way, because I'm going to start with the regen breaking point again, so that the editors can cut that piece back in.
And
So
your
when I'm
English is
driving my
really interesting. Hold on a second. What are you trying to say in the
sorry,
chat?
I just said, oh, the police complain that all the EVs are too slow. They can't use them for high speed pursuit because they're capped out.
Governed.
They cap them all out about 110 miles an hour, so they can't do high speed pursuit. Anyhow, when I'm driving my EV, I tend to find I use the regen braking a lot more. But what I'm really interested in, Jill, is you've got a new role recently. You've joined AFRY. Who are AFRY and what do they do?
Yeah, so I've been with AFRY a little while now as a principal consultant in their future cities and mobility team, part of the management consulting division. Um, so AFRY, we've been around, would you believe it, for over 125 years. We were founded in Malmö in Sweden in 1895. And we are a global sustainable engineering, design and advisory company. One of the things I really love about working for AFRY is that AFRY has a really clear purpose, and that is to accelerate the transition towards a more sustainable society. So what does that actually mean? So my role in the business is to really help build up the e-mobility business in the UK. We have a wealth of experience in the electric mobility field. We support clients on transport decarbonisation, like electrification of fleets. We provide technical guidance for the development of smart cities, for example. And one of the things, if we take EV charging infrastructure as an example, we know that the growth of electric mobility really requires a lot of investment in charging infrastructure. So we can model the pace of growth and the type of infrastructure needed. We know that the additional electricity demand from EVs creates a challenge for electricity networks, which is a lot of my earlier work, ironically. So we can provide really deep insight through our state-of-the-art power market modelling software that is called Bid3. And we also understand that vehicle charging infrastructure is actually is a relatively new type of network still. So we advise our clients in both the private and public sectors on new market entry design and regulations. So, for example, if there was a charge point operator in the UK and they were looking to either expand their network either in the UK or indeed enter a new market overseas, then we would really help them with the market assessments to look at the potential and to understand the capex and opex of that move and to help them build up the business model. And also we can do all the price projections as well for them. So we do a lot of really exciting work. And the kind of the longer I'm with AFRY, the more I'm learning for sure about what we can do. It's exciting, and it's actually really, really nice to be back in the consultancy space as well.
And you referenced briefly there a couple of your earlier experiences in electricity distribution. Could you give us an example of some of those really early, sort of pioneering projects that you were involved in back at the beginning of this EV transition?
Yes, of course. Yes. So back in 2012, it was day 2 in the new job back then, actually. And somebody put a piece of paper on my desk and said, "Jill, will you fill this out, please? It's an expression of interest form." So that piece of paper became the £10 million worth of My Electric Avenue project, which was the first project of its kind to really look at the impact of clusters of electric cars on the local electricity network. And we also tried a really, really early form, I think probably one of the first forms of smart charging, which wasn't called smart charging then, it was demand control technology. And we had over 200 trial participants, all driving around in Nissan Leafs for 2 years. So we had loads and loads of data, a wealth of data on both EV driving behavior, but also charging behavior as well. So we learned so much. And a lot of it was about understanding how consumers, how EV drivers would accept having their charging managed. And luckily, we found that by and large, they would accept having their charging managed. So that project was followed by a project called Electric Nation, which was kind of a little bit like My Electric Avenue, but on steroids. Because whilst My Electric Avenue only involved the Nissan Leaf, the Electric Nation project worked with trial participants in a whole range of both all electric and also plug-in hybrid electric vehicles to understand the impact of smart charging on those vehicles. But also we did dabble in vehicle to grid actually at that time as well. So I think that was one of the earliest projects looking at vehicle to grid. And I remember at the time it was a huge challenge sourcing a single phase compliant V2G charger because they were all three phase, for commercial use, but for domestic use, they, barely existed back then. So that was really fascinating work. And actually, quite a lot of that work and the findings from those kind of projects informed the government's position on smart charging and really helped inform the Automated and Electric Vehicles Act in the UK that has mandated smart charging and so on. And one of the big things that we learned from My Electric Avenue was that there was actually no collaboration and no communication between the automotive sector and the energy networks. So I brought together, with the help of, oh my goodness me, they are now Zemo Partnership, low CVP at the time. So yes, I had a meeting with low CVP, who are now Zemo, and said, look, can we do something together? The result of that was that we brought together a whole range of stakeholders across automotive, energy, and elsewhere. That formed the EV Network Group that ultimately became the government's EV Energy Task Force, which did a whole load of really, really good work in trying to bring together the transport and energy sectors to really kind of make sure that everything just works in harmony. I'm not sure whether we're there quite yet, but it was certainly a good start.
When you did the earlier study, you talked about the first effort where it was all leaps in a kind of a single vendor's vehicle. Are EVs getting to be commodity enough that you can drop in any vendor in one of these studies, and is the behavior the same, or is there so much differentiation between, if I buy a Hyundai and I buy a Leaf and I buy a Tesla or whatever EV I buy, are they from the grid side going to be the same, or is there going to be different behaviors because of the manufacturer's car?
I think it's really interesting so we have the distribution network operators kind of doing their thing, and their role is to protect the local electricity network, in GB. But then what has happened, I think, is that the energy suppliers have come in and said, well, actually, we can bring out some really nice products, such as, EV friendly time of use tariffs. And that's actually made a huge difference in terms of both protecting the grid, but also really incentivizing the consumer to change their behavior accordingly, and only charging off peak, for example. And whether it is sort of vehicle specific, there's so many complexities around it. But some vehicles will communicate with a particular smart charger, some won't, and so there's all sorts of different ways that it's all sort of the communications take place, which is far too complex for me to get my head around most of the time. But really, as an EV driver, all I want to do at the domestic, at home, is to be able to plug in my car when I get home. I don't really care when it charges, but I just want to know that when I wake up, it will be topped up to about 80%, and then I can, do what I need to do. And the benefit is that it's really cost me hardly anything at all to do that.
So, Jill, I'm originally from Scotland, despite my very English accent. And in Scotland, they have the Scottish Electric Vehicle Association. What are we doing here in England?
So this was really the highlight of lockdown 2020 for me. I was approached to help start up Electric Vehicle Association England. So I was a co-founding director of EVA England in lockdown, and we actually learned so much from EVA Scotland. You know, I think they'd been going about 10 years at the time, so what, they'll have been going 12, 13 years by now. But there was no association for EV drivers in England. There's an emerging one in Wales now, and actually they are all over. They are global, and there is a global organisation called GEVA, GEVA, Global Electric Vehicle Association. I think that stands for. So it's astonishing how many of these groups have been set up. EVA England was set up as a community interest company, really to act as that conduit between the electric vehicle driver, so both the current and prospective EV driver, and government. You know, and EVA England has done so much good work on the policy front, really so much work, especially behind the scenes, to underpin and support current and drive forward current government policy. So yeah, anybody who's not a member, I would encourage you to look them up. It's a great source of information and support.
Yeah, that's the huge benefit of this idea of the electric transition. You can plug in at night, you can wake up in the morning, and happy days, your car is charged in the morning. We've been on quite a journey, Jill, through some of the work you're doing in your new role at AFRY, but also through some of the FUD busting that's required, and then the history of how some of the early pioneering projects set the landscape for current government regulations. It's been super exciting. Thank you very much, and a real insight for many of our listeners.
Thank you so much, Neil. Thank you so much, Chris.
For our audience, this concludes another episode of the Insider's Guide to Energy EV series. We hope you've enjoyed this content. Don't forget to share it with your friends, comment on LinkedIn, and definitely follow us on YouTube to catch some exclusive content. We'll talk to you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. Bye-bye for now.